Welcome back, and now with the news in detail. The US has more than 65,000 people are tested positive for COVID-19 in the past 24 hours. The countrywide cases have crossed 3.1 million with over 133,000 deaths. The global number of coronavirus cases has exceeded 12.2 million, with the death toll nearing 555,000. This report has the details.
The new coronavirus is wreaking havoc in the Americas, tumbling records of daily deaths and infections. In the virus epicenter of Latin America, Brazil has reported over 1,200 deaths, while Mexico recorded 730 fatalities in the last 24 hours. Bolivia's President Janine Áñez has tested positive after Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro, who doctors say is recovering well. Meanwhile, U.S. infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci has blamed the unprecedented spike in cases on the haste to open up the economy. Doctors and nurses are struggling to cope as COVID-19 patients flood hospitals in over 36 states of the U.S. California is facing the double threat of rising coronavirus numbers as it enters peak wildfire season.
I want to encourage everybody in the same spirit of responsibility as it relates to mitigating the transmission of COVID-19 to see what we can do to mitigate the loss of lives and property by focusing on evacuation plans, focusing on the needs to do the kind of, just work at the house.
South Africa has announced its highest daily infections with over 13,500 testing positive. Africa's most developed country is now a hotspot with over 238,000 cases. Algeria is reimposing travel restrictions and has increased testing in a bid to stop a rise in infection. Over in Australia, Prime Minister Scott Morrison says the number of overseas arrivals will be capped at 4,000 people each week.
We also agreed today a reduction in the number of inbound arrivals into Australia across those ports that are able to accept returning Australian citizens and residents. Of course, there are no flights going into Melbourne, into Victoria, for obvious reasons.
In Asia,
Well, news just in. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan is speaking at the first meeting of the National Coordination Committee on Housing Construction and Development. Let's watch live.
मुख्तलिफ किस्म के टैक्सेस थे, परमिशंस उनको नहीं मिलती थी, वो परमिशन लेते लेते इतना देर लगती थी, फिर रिश्वत देनी पड़ती थी, फिर अगर वो परमिशन एक ही मिलती थी, यूटिलिटीज़ की परमिशन, यानी कंस्ट्रक्शन इंडस्ट्री के सामने बड़ी रुकावटें थी. तो ये जो आज हमने कमेटी बनाई है,
construction industry was facing. And the committee which has been formed, the major purpose of this committee is
और सारों हमने सूबों को साथ बैठाया है क्योंकि कई चीजें फेडरल गवर्नमेंट के पास हैं
the construction industry
सूबों के पास हैं जो सूबों के हकूक हैं, जो सूबों के इख्तियारात हैं. तो आज सारे सूबों के साथ बैठ के हमने मीटिंग की है. अभी मीटिंग खत्म हुई है और ये पहली हमारी, जिस तरह मैंने कहा, मीटिंग है नेशनल कोऑर्डिनेशन कमेटी की. इसका एक और मकसद है और वो दूसरा मकसद ये है कि
This was the first meeting of the National Coordination Committee and all the provinces have been invited in this particular meeting today, which is the first one.
Recession आई हुई है, एक नौकरियां चली गई हैं, बेरोजगारी बढ़ गई है.
And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the country is facing economic recession and there is a rise in unemployment across the country as well. So it has become a challenge for the government. Not only for the government in Pakistan, but also for the governments across the world, in order to chalk out the plans and strategies in order to how to run the economy.
कि किसी तरह इकोनॉमी को चलाना शुरू करें. तो हमने ये फैसला किया है कि हमने हाउसिंग के जरिए और कंस्ट्रक्शन इंडस्ट्री के जरिए अपनी इकोनॉमी खड़ी करनी है ताकि लोगों को रोजगार.
We have decided in order to run our economy and uplift it from the impact of COVID-19, we have decided that this should be done through housing and the construction industry.
दूसरा मकसद ये है कि जो भी कंस्ट्रक्शन इंडस्ट्री, अब एक तो नया पाकिस्तान हाउसिंग है जो सिर्फ
Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan is speaking at the first meeting of the National Coordination Committee on Housing Construction and Development. That was the latest. We'll continue to update regarding this particular development as to what the Prime Minister said. Now moving on, in Pakistan, the death toll from COVID-19 has crossed 5,000 after another 75 people lost their lives. The Ministry of Health says more than 2,500 cases have been reported in the past 24 hours, with the tally crossing 243,000. The ministry said over 149,000 people have recovered from the virus so far. It said among over 89,000 active cases, 2,375 are critically ill. The province of Sindh is the worst hit with over 100,000 infections now, while Punjab has reported over 85,000 cases. Moreover, India has reported its biggest single-day surge in COVID-19 cases, with more than 26,000 new infections. With another 475 deaths overnight, the nationwide toll is nearly 22,000. The health ministry said major cities like Delhi, Mumbai and Chennai were badly affected by the virus. The new cases take India's total number of infections to nearly 794,000. The health ministry says there are over 276,000 active coronavirus cases in the country. In Nepal, at least 12 people have been killed after heavy monsoon rains triggered landslides in the mid-western and eastern regions. Officials say 30 people are believed to be missing and at least 20 are wounded. They say major rivers in the country have swollen due to the continuous downpour for the last 48 hours. The Met Department said the monsoon rains will last for another 3 days. China says it will hit the U.S. with reciprocal measures over fresh sanctions against Chinese politicians. Addressing the press, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian said Washington's move is deeply detrimental to bilateral relations. He said the U.S. action marked serious interference in China's internal affairs. This comes after Washington announced new curbs on 4 Chinese officials for alleged human rights violations against minorities. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said regional Communist Party boss Chen Guangzhou, 3 officials and their families won't be allowed entry to the U.S. The act also mandates freezing any U.S. assets and prohibitions on Americans doing business with them. The U.S. has approved a $620 million upgrade package for Patriot surface-to-air missiles for Taiwan. The State Department said the upgrade will modernize Taipei's armed forces and help it to maintain a credible defensive capability. It said upgrading components of the missiles will support an operational life of 30 years. Taiwan's defense ministry said the arms deal demonstrates the importance Washington attaches to Taipei's national security. The ministry said the arms sale will take effect in the next month, a 7th such deal during the U.S. President Donald Trump's tenure. Taipei has been bolstering its defenses in the face of increased military moves by Beijing, which claims the island as its own territory. The U.S. has approved an estimated $23 billion deal to sell 105 Lockheed Martin F-35 fighter jets to Japan. The State Department said maintaining Tokyo's effective self-defense capability is vital to the U.S. interests. It said the proposed sale will not change the military balance in the region. In a press release, the Pentagon said Tokyo also requested 110 F-135 engines and related equipment. Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency said implementation of the proposed deal will take 25 years. North Korea says another summit with the U.S. will be unnecessary and useless as long as there is no change in Washington's stance. Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korea's supreme leader Jong-un, said Pyongyang will denuclearize, but Washington will have to take major steps. In a statement carried by state media, she said the resumption of talks depends on Washington ending its hostilities. Kim said Pyongyang will not give up the Yongbyon nuclear complex in exchange for sanctions relief. She said Pyongyang will not alter its strategies just because North's leader and U.S. President Donald Trump have a cordial personal relationship. Earlier, Trump said, and the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo expressed hope to reopen the stalled negotiations. The U.S. Department of State has invited Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov for a new round of talks on strategic stability. Earlier, Ryabkov announced that the consultations on strategic stability were set for mid-July. On June the 22nd, Russia and the US held talks on arms control behind closed doors in Vienna. The country's delegations were headed by Rybkov and US Special Presidential Envoy for Arms Control Marshal Billingsley. The issue of extending the New START treaty was also on the agenda. Moscow and Washington have agreed on an initiative to form an expert group on security in outer space following talks in January. Russia says the risks of nuclear confrontation between Moscow and Washington have seriously increased recently. This comes as President Donald Trump announced US withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty in May. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow is prepared to discuss control over new weapons system with Washington. But the foreign minister said he was not optimistic that the New START nuclear arms control treaty will be extended. Earlier, Russia's defense ministry said it will take all the necessary measures with the US withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty. The agreement provides for inspection flights over member countries to monitor military activities. In Greece, violence broke out in Athens during a mass demonstrations against the government's proposed law to curb public protests. Riot police fired tear gas and flash grenades at a group of protesters who hurled petrol bombs at them. The demonstrations were also held in 40 other cities apart from the capital. More than 10,000 peaceful protesters gathered in the central Athens, many supporting a labor union backed by the Greek Communist Party. But Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis has not backed down, saying he is determined to stop gatherings from disrupting traffic and commercial activity.
The freedom for someone to be able to get to a hospital, to get to his job, to his home, to be able to go out for a walk with his kids is just as precious as the freedom to demonstrate. In a democracy, the right of one does not overrule the right of the rest.
UNESCO says it must be notified of any change in the status of Istanbul's 6th century Hagia Sophia Museum. The UN cultural body said any changes to the museum's status may have to be reviewed by its World Heritage Committee. It said the Hagia Sophia was on its list of World Heritage Sites as a museum and had certain commitments and legal obligations. Meanwhile, a spokesperson for Turkish president says reopening Hagia Sophia for prayers will not deprive it of its identity. He said the place will always be a part of world's historical heritage. The site was at the center of both the Christian, Byzantine and Muslim Ottoman empires. Turkey's top administrative court is likely to announce today the 1934 conversion of the Hagia Sophia into a museum was unlawful. In Serbia, the government has scrapped plans to impose a weekend COVID-19 curfew in Belgrade after 2 nights of protests. A government crisis group tasked with fighting the virus has decided instead to ban public gatherings of more than 10 people. This came after violent clashes broke out between police and people protesting the lockdown measures. Thousands violated the ban last night by staging a sit-in in front of the parliament amid heavy police presence. Meanwhile, Russia has rejected Serbian media reports alleging Moscow of fueling the unrest. Moving on, Israeli forces have shot and martyred a Palestinian youth in the occupied West Bank. In a statement, the Palestinian Health Ministry said the citizen was killed in Kofl Haris village near the northern city of Salfit. The incident took place after clashes broke out between Israeli soldiers and young Palestinians in the village. Health officials said the martyred youth succumbed to wounds after he was shot in the neck. Eyewitnesses said the Palestinian was shot in cold blood while out walking with his friends. Tensions in the region are high since Israel announced plans to annex major parts of the West Bank this month. French President Emmanuel Macron has asked Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to refrain from annexing Palestinian territories. In a statement, the Élysée Palace said Macron warned Netanyahu in a phone call that annexation will seriously harm peace efforts. The statement said Macron emphasized such a move will contravene international law. The president said that annexation will jeopardize the possibility of a two-state solution. On Tuesday, Egypt, France, Germany and Jordan urged Israel to abandon plans to annex the parts of the West Bank. The foreign ministers of the three countries warned such action can have consequences for the bilateral relations. In a related development, a subcommittee in the U.S. House of Representatives has approved a measure that will restore aid to Palestinians. Trump administration cut off aid in 2018 after Palestinian officials dismissed the president's peace plan. Committee chairperson Nita Lowey introduced the amendment. The step will restore $255 million in aid to Palestine during the 2021 fiscal year, which begins on 1st October this year. The amendment will effectively strip the authority of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to suspend aid to the Palestinian territories. Lowey said non-governmental organizations working in the West Bank and Gaza will benefit from the funds. The global chemical weapons watchdog has voted to take action on a probe that blamed Syria for nerve gas attacks for the first time. In April, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons found the Syrian Air Force used sarin gas and chlorine on citizens in March 2017. Diplomats said Russia, China, and Iran voted against the decision at the OPCW's Executive Council. The organization accused the Syrian government of breaching the Chemical Weapons Convention. British envoy to the bloc, Peter Wilson, said the countries had voted to act on the investigation and identification team report. He said 29 votes were in favor, 3 against, with 9 abstains. Earlier this week, OPCW chief Fernando Arias said the team is investigating further incidents in Syria. Moving on, Pakistan's Minister for Human Rights, Dr. Shri Mazari, has written a letter to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights about the worsening situation in Indian-occupied Kashmir. In a letter addressed to the Commission Chair, Michelle Bachelet, the minister expressed grave concern over India's illegal annexation of the occupied valley. Dr. Mazari highlighted the forcible transfer of civilian populations to and from Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir. She said that India has issued around 25,000 Indian citizens domicile certificates in occupied Jammu and Kashmir in a blatant violation of 4th Geneva Convention. Mazari called for an urgent intervention by the UN High Commissioner to end the breaches of fundamental human rights norms. Pakistan has reopened Angur Adda border crossing with Afghanistan to resume trade between the two countries. The crossing was closed down in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic to contain the spread of the virus. The border points in Torkham, Chaman and Ghulam Khan have already been open since June the 22nd. Pakistan has already reopened its border with Iran. More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. In Nepal, cable operators have banned all the Indian news channels except the government-owned Doordarshan television. They took the decision amid mounting tensions over a map row between Kathmandu and New Delhi.
Although the decision has not been taken by the Nepalese government, Information Minister Yuparaj Khatiwala says Nepal may seek political and legal remedies against Indian media for attacking Nepal's sovereignty and dignity. This comes in the wake of public outrage against Indian media for its coverage, which citizens claimed portrayed Nepalese leadership in a bad light. Indian news channels indulged in character assassination of Nepalese leaders and of the Chinese envoy to Nepal, Ambassador Ho Young-ki. India and Nepal are currently engaged in a diplomatic scuffle after the Nepalese parliament claimed ownership of 3 disputed areas. New Delhi contests Kathmandu's claim.
Sudan's Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok has replaced the finance, foreign, energy and health ministers and 3 others as part of a sweeping reshuffle. In a statement, the government said Hamdok has named interim replacements to lead all 7 ministries. Hamdok leads a government of technocrats under the 39-month power-sharing agreement between the military and the civilian groups. The agreement was reached following the removal of the country's longtime ruler Umar al-Bashir last year. The cabinet reshuffle comes 9 days after violent protests against government's coronavirus response and economic crisis. Bali is hosting the first center to return captive and rescued dolphins to the wild. The founder of the Dolphin Project, the charity that runs the center, says this model can be replicated in other countries. Details in this report.
Just a year ago, Rambo the dolphin was confined to a shallow chlorinated pool in an Indonesian hotel in the island of Bali, entertaining visitors from around the world by jumping through hoops. Now, the bottlenose dolphin, estimated to be about 15 years old, is swimming freely after being brought to what organizers say is the world's first permanent rehabilitation center. This is a project initiated by Bali's government and animal rights groups.
Well, it's very exciting. It's been 50 years in the making. It's the first dolphin sanctuary anywhere in the world. And it's a model. It can be duplicated. And we're trying to do that in Europe as well, in Italy and in Crete.
A 2019 report says more than 3,000 dolphins were in captivity in 336 entertainment venues globally as part of an industry generating up to $5.5 billion annually. Returning dolphins to the wild depends on their health and capability to catch prey and interact with other dolphins. One problem is that dolphins often switch off their sonar in captivity.
And once we will relocate them to be released, they will go to the area where they were originally captured, because we know where they were captured in Central Java. So we aim to relocate them to their area that they know, where they grew up.
The Bali government hopes to emulate the Dolphin Project to save other species. For Rick O'Barry, who in the past trained dolphins used in the TV series Flipper, opening the sanctuary in Bali is another step in his goal to end captivity.
European markets have raised early losses but remain muted over concerns about spiking COVID-19 cases in the US and elsewhere. The pan-European stock 600 hovered just above the flat line by mid-morning. France's CAC 40 traded a fraction higher. London's FTSE and Germany's DAX have so far gained fractionally. Earlier, Asia-Pacific markets fell as investors remained cautious over coronavirus resurgence. Another weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus News.